Hello and welcome back. In the final lecture for this week, we will briefly be going through some of the secondary source readings that we had discussing zombies in video games. First, we will look at zombies in game space, form, context, and meaning in zombie-based video games, by Tanya Krasowinska, hereafter referred to as TK. This chapter, along with Now I'm Feeling Zombified, comes from the larger edited book Zombie Culture. TK explains that the wide prevalence of zombies in video games stems from contemporary cultural fears about the loss of autonomy and scientific apocalyptic devastation, as well as technological limitations and their market value. Ultimately, game zombies provide the ideal enemy. They are strong, relentless, and already dead. They look spectacularly horrific, and they invite the player to blow them away without guilt or a second thought. In exploring this phenomenon and the influence of zombie films on these games, TK examines market and genre values, technological values, gameplay values, and player control. In terms of market and genre value, TK explains that video games have a tendency to manage risk and stick with dependable formulas to minimize commercial failure. Thus, at their core, most zombie games focus on shooting and other violent mechanics in order to appeal to their main male market audience. The game difficulty is either controlled through difficulty settings or through a structured learning curve. Players are likewise able to feel in control of the horror world as they become more skilled and powerful in the game. These are many of the same elements that horror films use to attract their viewers. In looking at technological values, TK argues that one of the main ways that games attract players is by continuing to utilize new technological developments in order to improve game graphics. For example, the creation of three-dimensional graphics allowed game developers to introduce a more experiential game world while also bringing in elements of shock scares that were impossible with earlier technology. Like with the market value, TK suggests that decisions by developers are influenced by zombies in film. For instance, the neo-expressionist camera angles and cutscenes from Night of the Living Dead that influenced Resident Evil. The increase in graphical abilities is likewise responsible for changes in gameplay and mechanics as well, including the decision to make zombies move more quickly and decisively. In the next section on gameplay values, TK reminds us that video games are unique in their player-centric focus. Within the preset parameters of the different game types, players are to varying degrees offered a certain freedom to move at will within and act upon the game world to accomplish set and sometimes self-directed tasks. This agency is more or less restrictive based on the type of game. For instance, on the far end of the agency spectrum are rail shooter games like House of the Dead 3. Games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, however, allow for a more open world experience, allowing players to explore the game space. Ultimately, through the need to explore, these games are able to create another element of anticipation and suspense for players. TK explains that, influenced by elements of sight as well as sound, the player is kept in a state of wary preparedness that is extremely suspenseful. The story structure of these games is sometimes also influenced by player choice, causing branching narratives and different developments in the game. Once again, this is true for certain games more than others. Role-playing games are often the most intertwined with player input. In looking at elements of control, TK once again highlights the importance of player agency, arguing that the primary theme of horror is the relationship between power and powerlessness. Thus, the player's autonomy is regularly put to the test, undermined, or threatened in this genre. This is found not only in fighting and surviving hordes of the undead, but also in intervening to rescue non-player characters. And your actions can have consequences, affecting the progression of the game, cause and effect. While some have argued that the presence of zombies in video games as easily defeated cannon fodder gives little opportunity for players to dwell on their deeper possible meanings and representations, TK argues that it is actually the game itself that forces players to understand their own agency and the impacts of the other. Turning now to the book Zombies Among Us, we will look at Gareth Scott's Digital Dead translating the visceral and satirical elements of George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead to video games. Scott begins by arguing that the video game Space Invaders served as an earlier inspiration for the zombie video game genre. And the game likewise raised issues such as the harmfulness of video games and reflections of society that are still considered today. In the same year, 1978, George Romero's Dawn of the Dead came out, serving as a criticism of American hedonistic consumerism. Thus, Romero's zombies are themselves still slaves of consumerism, while at the same time serving as a metaphor for government ineptitude, societal decay, greed, and exploitation. Indeed, the same target audience for such zombie video games, adolescent teens, happens to be the most targeted demographic for American consumerism. Thus, instead of perceiving game players as possessing active, critical, and productive relationships with popular texts, they are more popularly deemed as simply avid, loyal consumers of the mass-produced commodities of popular culture. Scott looks to draw associations between the setting of Dawn of the Dead and the structure and nature of video game texts. Pointing to Grand Theft Auto, he explains that video game designers function as symbol creators, constructing text by creating new assemblages from existing cultural symbols. And much like with the development of video games, mall developers use similar environmental and architectural analyses in planning the form and experience of shopping. It is such spatial design that allows for environmental storytelling, telling a story through the experience of traveling through a real or imagined physical space. Again, we see this with the mall setting of Dawn of the Dead. Ultimately, both storyline as well as survival is inseparable from the player's environment. After pointing out the positives and importance of horror games, despite claims of negative impacts towards violence, Scott examines the game Dead Rising, in which players play as the photojournalist Frank West, who photographs and then eventually experiences the zombie outbreak at the Willamette Parkview Mall. This game, too, mirrors many of the features and deeper elements of Romero's Dawn of the Dead. For example, like the film, players of Dead Rising have a great deal of choice at their disposal in how they handle the zombies, employing everything from chainsaws to children's toys. Similarly, Scott argues that digital consumption, especially found through video games, is quite similar to material consumption. Malls likewise represent social spaces to spend time, just like video games. Thus, for teenagers, games like Dead Rising provide them with an opportunity to resist the forces that control social spaces and to experience consumerism as play. The next reading we will look at from the same book is How the Zombie Changed Video Games by Matthew J. Weiss. Once more, Weiss looks at the way in which the utilization of zombies in video games is influenced by Romero's creation. In questioning why the 90s saw zombies return to popularity, Weiss, along with others, points to the innovation and success of the PlayStation game Resident Evil. Utilizing Romero-style lumbering zombies, this game serves as the real creation of the video game genre. And as such, zombies in video games can be seen as categorized as either before or after Resident Evil. This popular zombie, as first depicted by George Romero's 1968 Night of the Living Dead, had important distinguishable characteristics from older depictions of zombies. They were first of all autonomous, needing no sorcerer to animate or control them. They ate flesh, being driven by an endless desire for victims. Lastly, they were infectious, meaning they could turn the living into zombies by biting them. This characterization of zombies has largely stayed consistent across all media portraying the undead, thanks in no small part to the seriousness with which Resident Evil utilizes the zombie. Despite more or less focus on the global reaction to zombies given budget and technology limitations, as well as the shift around the time of 28 Days Later to a more fast-moving zombie, Romero's depiction of zombies have not been totally abandoned. In addition to looking closer at the portrayal of zombies in Resident Evil, Weiss goes on to examine the digital zombie both before and after Mikami's 1996 game. In pointing to games like Wizardry and Castlevania, Weiss explains that some of these earlier games had zombies steeped in occult magic. And while games like Uninvited managed to capture the ruthless logic of zombies, in which one misstep meant instant death, the game ultimately fails to simulate the Romero zombie. The Romero 1986 game, Zombie, as well as the Lovecraft-inspired Alone in the Dark, likewise served as important games in the evolution of digital zombies before Resident Evil. Despite sharing many similarities with Alone in the Dark, Mikami's Resident Evil was the first game to present itself as a zombie survival narrative, forcing players to escape from a zombie-infested mansion. Ultimately, in allowing players to understand the subtle threat that zombies always imposed, by reinforcing the benefit of attacking the head, and by carefully working elements of viral infection into the storyline narrative, Resident Evil works to digitize Romero's zombie in the game, in fact creating a very atypical video game enemy in the process. After Resident Evil, a number of zombie-based games continued to be developed, in no small part due to its influence. And while Resident Evil can be considered to be the start of the survival horror genre, some of the games influenced were neither horror nor survival games. And indeed, as more games came out, even within the Resident Evil franchise, the portrayal of the zombie began to stray from the characteristics established by Romero: flesh-eating, destruction of the brain, slow movement, and infection. Weiss goes into each of these categories in turn, tracing how games evolved and expanded these zombie definitions. Thus, for example, in Resident Evil 4 and 5, as well as games like the Left 4 Dead series, we see a shift to fast-moving zombies, forcing players to rely on firepower and skill rather than planning, strategy, and caution. Nor indeed, with a few exceptions like Dead Rising, are there many games after Resident Evil 4 that feature the slow, lumbering zombies popularized in the first game of the franchise. In tracing these changes, Weiss concludes that there is an ideological shift over these 14 years given the move from survival to shooter, moving from resource management and selective agency to skill-based combat. Thus, Weiss argues that there has been a general drift away from the anxiety and disempowerment towards the thrill of entertainment and empowerment, no doubt in some ways following the cultural and ideological shifts that occurred post 9/11. For example, Left 4 Dead's positive view of the military and the corresponding suggestion that society isn't completely collapsed also seems to speak to the post 9/11 timidity that mainstream American culture has towards fatalistic anti-establishment narratives. The fourth reading for this week was Ron Scott's Now I'm Feeling Zombified, Playing the Zombie Online. I'm not going to go into detail about this interesting book chapter because instead I've decided to open up an opportunity for some extra credit. If you want to, in your chapter summaries, you can choose to give an extended response to this chapter, around 500 words, in which you give a detailed analysis of Scott's argument, the sources he uses, the games he examines, and how strong the argument is. I know there can be a lot of confusion and ambiguity with an online course that can cause you to lose points here or there on assignments. If you choose to take on this extended analysis then of the Scott reading, again totally optional, I will give you a bump to your discussion posts and your summaries. Ultimately, in considering all four of these readings, I would like you to consider two larger questions as you continue thinking about video games and moving forward with your final paper. First, many of these readings look at the ways in which film, especially George Romero's works, have had a profound effect on the way that video games portray zombies and create game space. What other media and factors do you think influence the development of video games? And how might these medias have affected the development of the game that you are looking at for your final paper? Second, after reading these chapters, what are some ways, in addition to American consumerism, that the use of zombies in video games and their portrayal reflects different historical realities and perceptions? That's all for this lecture. For our next and final week, we will have no readings and only one lecture, as your final paper is due on that Friday. As always, please don't hesitate to ask me if you have any questions or concerns. The one lecture next week will look at some tips and strategies behind writing a proper historical paper. See you then.